will we really force those on the creative and worship front lines to give up their calling just so they can live? It's their work that is meant to give the rest of us something to live for. Should Christian musicians and artists be paid? How do you feel when someone asks for some support for a creative arts project? A little wary, perhaps a little suspicious? We live in a world where the creative arts are often seen as a luxury, something a bit extra, something as a bit of a diversion after the real work's been done. So whenever an artist or a musician asks, would you consider supporting this project? It can feel a little indulgent. But what if it's not? For some of us, our creativity isn't about ego or even about self-expression. It's about answering a call to create spaces where heaven and earth meet, where people can encounter God. And this isn't a new idea. Making space for heaven on earth. Exodus 31 tells us that God calls the man Bezalel by name, and he fills him with wisdom, with understanding, with knowledge, and all kinds of artistic skill. And he is appointed to construct the tabernacle according to the blueprints that Moses had received directly from God. And this was so that it would house and could house the Ark of the Covenant and serve as the place where God's presence would dwell in the middle of his people. Bezalel is also the first person the Bible records as being filled with the Spirit of God. It wasn't the prophet, it wasn't the priest, it wasn't the king. It was an artist, a maker of beautiful things. And this beauty wasn't merely decoration either. The tabernacle was a place of encounter where God's presence dwelled. A cloud by day and a fire by night. It was a place for meeting, for guidance, and for protection. Bezalel and his multi-skilled team of designers, metalworkers, carpenters, stonecutters, tailors, embroiderers, leather workers, and more. They weren't just making things. They were making a place. They were making a space for God himself to dwell and a place for his people to come close. And that's why we create. It's not for art's sake. It's not for applause. It's to craft an atmosphere. It's a place where hearts can open and God draws near. Back as for Bezalel's blueprint. Of course, inspiration alone never gets the job done, does it? So how was Bezalel's vision resourced? Ordinary people. The building of the tabernacle may well have been one of the first crowd-funded projects in history, and it was wildly successful. If you read Exodus 36, you'll see, and it tells us that the people gave so much into the project that Moses had to force them to stop giving. Imagine the generosity towards an art project so overflowing that the problem was never lack, but too much. Supporting the servants. Later, God established this kind of support on a permanent basis. The Levites, who were essentially God's worship leaders, they were set apart for full-time service, and they were not given any land as an inheritance like the other tribes were. It was down to the rest of Israel to provide for them through their tithes and offerings, which freed them from the burden of provision so that they could focus full-time on the ministry, much of which was music-based worship. It says in Numbers 18:24, "For the tithe of the people of Israel, which they present as a contribution to the Lord, I have given to the Levites for an inheritance." You see, their music wasn't performance, it wasn't background ambience, it was essential to the spiritual life of the nation. At a certain point in time, Nehemiah discovered that the Levites were no longer receiving support from the people, and he was furious because they'd had to abandon their priestly musical calling and go and work in the fields in order to survive, and the music had stopped. You can read about this in Nehemiah chapter 13. Worship is warfare. Levitical musicians weren't hobbyists. They were chosen. They were trained, and they were even placed by military leaders as part of Israel's worship and warfare. Look at David. Jehoshaphat, Gideon, the fall of Jericho, they all reveal the same truth, that worship is warfare. And those ministering spiritually through prophetic worship were meant to be materially supported by the wider community. Yet today, we often send worship musicians into spiritual battle with little training, minimal support, and sometimes even expecting them to pay for the privilege of serving in this way. I've come across churches that make people show proof of giving before they're even allowed to join a worship team. And that, to me, is exactly the opposite of how it should be. We should be supporting those on the front lines, not making them pay to play. The Apostle Paul asked in 1 Corinthians 9:7, "Whoever serves as a soldier at his own expense." Being a musician is a spiritual gift on the behalf of others. So shouldn't musical work be honoured and supported like any other ministry, especially if it's involving spiritual warfare? And we see this in the life of David, for example, when he brought freedom to King Saul, who was being tormented by an evil spirit. David played his harp and the spirit left. And Elisha called for a musician to create the atmosphere that would bring God's presence so that he could prophesy. These examples show the spiritual power of music. It brings deliverance, it brings God's presence, and it brings revelation. Paul's defense of spiritual workers. The Apostle Paul continues his argument. In 1 Corinthians 9 verse 4 he says, "Don't we have the right to food and drink?" Or he says in 1 Corinthians 9:6, "Or is it only Barnabas and I who have to keep on working for a living?" A modern musician might say, "Well, don't I have the right to feed my family just as much as a pastor or an overseas missionary does? Is it biblical to raise money for strangers abroad while those who are ministering week after week in your own community are struggling to survive?" I'm not saying it's wrong to go to other nations, of course I'm not, but I do wonder how it is that we often overlook those right on our doorstep. There's something noble sounding and even exciting about being a pioneer in a faraway place, but just look around your town, look around the local schools and the colleges, or even down your own street. Look, although there are people, they may not live in another country, it's actually worse in some ways. Many of them are on a complete other planet. They've built idols out of ideologies and maybe a specific song, a book, a painting, a film, whatever. Perhaps that is what's needed to break through and reach them. So my plea is, just take a quick look closer to home. There might be a fired up creative person sitting in the chair in front of you, saying to God, "Here I am, send me." But they can't afford to go. They might not be called to another country, but they're willing to step into another world, the culture around us that's become so spiritually alien to God. Caring for the household of faith. In church circles, we hear a lot about being the family of God, don't we? And the Bible's got a lot to say about how we treat family. In 1 Timothy 5:8, it says, "If anyone does not provide for his family, he's denied the faith, and he's worse than an unbeliever." Galatians 6:10. "Therefore, as we have the opportunity, let's work for the good of all, especially for those who belong to the household of faith." 1 John 3:17. "If anyone has this world's goods and he sees a fellow believer in need, but withholds compassion from him, how does God's love reside in him?" If we fail to care for those who are carrying this ministry, both the people and the music suffer. The quality declines, the anointing wanes, and the people turn elsewhere for a higher quality musical experience, even if its spiritual source is somewhat questionable. And this ought not to be our only option. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 9:11, "If we have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? If you muzzle the ox long enough, it'll eventually go somewhere else that it can eat." Today, many gifted prophetic musicians leave the church quietly, not because they've stopped believing, but because they can't survive. And while the nations are being discipled by media, literature, the arts and music, we too often lag behind, filling the silence with mediocre stabs at creativity that feel more like an afterthought than a response to a divine calling. History's patrons. The church once acted as a major patron of the arts, commissioning the likes of Michelangelo, Raphael, Haydn, Bach, Handel. The greatest art, architecture and music in history has been made possible by the support of patrons who believed that this kind of creativity was worth resourcing, and rarely has it been born in a vacuum. Bach's sacred masterpieces were sustained by the church. Handel faced financial ruin until a generous patron funded Messiah, which has become one of the most iconic works of sacred music. Haydn thrived under the support of a prominent Hungarian family, and Beethoven finished his great works through the support of friends and patrons. It's the same principle that we see in Scripture: God's people pooling resources in order to release beauty that connects people to Him. Borrowing capacity. The reality is many of the artists and musicians of the church must often create in the margins of their lives, in late nights, early mornings, or stolen moments between responsibilities. Their gifts are real, but their capacity is limited. God values the heart behind that work. He sees the devotion, the calling, the vision, and with support, encouragement, and resources, and a space to create, these artists and musicians can flourish, and their work can become more refined and empowered to open people's hearts and draw people into God's presence and shape lives. But without that support, the potential remains dormant, but with it, the impossible becomes possible. In 2 Kings 4, a desperate widow comes to the prophet Elisha, pleading for help. All she has is a small jar of oil, which isn't nearly enough to meet her need, and Elisha gives her a specific prophetic instruction. He says, "Go and borrow as many empty jars as you can from your friends and neighbours. Don't gather just a few." So she did as he said, and as long as there was room for the oil, it kept flowing. When every container was full, she was able to sell the oil, pay off her debts, and live on the rest. She already had the raw substance for what she needed for a miracle in her house, that little jar of oil, but she couldn't contain the increase on her own. So she went to her friends and neighbours for help, asking them to lend her empty containers so she could make space for what God wanted to pour out. And for each of them, letting go of a bowl or a jar was probably not much of a sacrifice, but the miracle worked because everybody acted together. Without everyone's help, without borrowed capacity, the oil would have stopped too soon. And the miracle was actually never just about multiplied oil. It was about the partnership. It was about the generosity and the selfless community obeying a prophetic instruction for the good of another person. And this is what facilitated the miracle of provision. Beyond the mainstream. Now here's something important. It's easy to notice the big projects, the ones in the spotlight, the ones that make the headlines, that trend on socials and pull in the big numbers. But not every artist is called to that spotlight. Some are carrying songs for the remnant, for the outcasts, for the unseen, for the forgotten. Their calling is not to entertain the crowd, but to minister to those on the margins. And both they and their audience depend on support that won't come from the mainstream, but from those willing to stand with them, outside of the camp, and say, "We see you, we believe in you, your work is important, and we want you to be able to keep going." Every great work needs support. Many of us will gladly pay to attend a concert. We'll pay good money to be moved, even if it's only for one evening, and that financial support buys the artist time and space to work on their craft, and so that they can come back with more. So how much more should we value those whose creativity opens hearts to God's presence? This isn't just a passing feel-good moment. It's about building spaces for divine encounter. It's sacred work, not just casual labour. Now, I know not everyone's called to create in this way, but every creator does need supporters. Every calling needs a community, generous individuals who can help lift that burden of provision so that musicians and artists can focus on beauty, truth, and the presence of God. And today, new works can be born that carry the presence of God to our generation. Let's not repeat the tragedy of the Levites who had to abandon their calling just to survive. Will we really force those on the creative and worship front lines to give up their calling just so they can live? It's their work that is meant to give the rest of us something to live for. Even if you're not called to create in this way, you can still help release those who are. Your support could release them from the burden of a dead-end job, allowing them to focus fully on their God-given calling. The question isn't whether God is still calling creative people. The question is, are we going to do our part to support them?